Hello and welcome to another GCSE History exam technique presentation. This presentation is going to focus on an 8-mark source evaluation question from paper 3, Germany paper, and we're going to be looking at early problems of the Weimar Republic. The presentation is going to relate to a question from the June 2018 exam. In order to do this, you're going to need the sources from that examination. If you don't have a copy of those sources, if you talk to your history teacher, they'll be able to get them for you. Let's remind ourselves of two problems from the early years of the Weimar Republic that feature in the sources. Firstly, the Freikorps and the Kapp Putsch of 1920. The Freikorps were a right-wing militia made up of ex-soldiers who had refused to demobilise at the end of the First World War, a group who were well organised and well armed, who had actually been used by the government to put down communist revolts, including the Spartacist uprising and the Red Rising in the Ruhr. So the government had used them before. However, once they'd served their purpose, they refused to disband in 1920 when the government had ordered them to. And this was one of the reasons why one of their leaders, Wolfgang Kapp, led a putsch to replace the government in 1920 that was very serious and needed a strike by the workers, organised by the government, to put it down. And secondly, hyperinflation. So this is one of the crises of 1923, the second of the three crises. Partly this had been caused by passive resistance in the Ruhr Valley against the French and Belgian invasion. In this episode, money had lost value, as you can see in the picture. People were no longer using it. There was bartering, there were chaotic scenes where people had to use huge amounts of money. In order to bring hyperinflation to a close, Gustav Stresemann introduced a new currency, writing off the old currency, and called off passive resistance. Now this in its turn led to further problems as one of the causes of the Munich Putsch. For our purposes in this question though, we're just going to focus on the economic chaos of 1923. So here's our question. How useful are sources B and C for an inquiry into the challenges facing the Weimar Republic in the years 1919 to 23? It is an 8-mark question, and it's phrased in a way that we can expect questions of this type to be asked in future exams. Starting with the words how useful, and then it'll ask us to look at a specific historical inquiry, and for us here this is the challenges facing the Weimar Republic in the years 1919 to 23. We'll be using two primary sources for this, one of which may be visual. Right, so we're going to need to study and annotate the sources before we attempt the question. This is a great use of our time. So for each source, in the caption, underline key features that you might use in your answer. The type of the source, the author, topic, the date that the source was made, and if we have it available to us, the location too. Now we're not going to use all of those in our answers, but we're going to use certainly one or two of those things. So it's great to make yourself aware of exactly what you're looking at. And then for our pictorial sources, label key aspects of content that you can see. And for our written sources, we should be underlining parts of the source that we might quote, and maybe also just jotting down the odd word at the side of the source as well. So here's a prepared version of source B. I've underlined in the caption the fact that this photograph comes from a German newspaper in 1920. Again, it shows us Freikorps soldiers taking part in the Kapp Putsch. I also think it might be of use to us to note that they're in Berlin and they're near the Reichstag building. To me that sticks out as something that I could maybe use in my answer. And from the photograph itself, the content that I've noticed is that possibly these Freikorps seem to be posing for this photograph. They're clearly heavily armed. They're very much in control of the situation that they find themselves in, and there seems to be quite a few of them there. I'm not going to use all of those in my answers, but those are just my first thoughts, and I'm going to be selecting the points that I use for maybe one or two of those. Okay, so here's what we need to do for each source. Firstly, we're going to discuss how useful the content is for the inquiry that we have. Secondly, what we'll be doing is we'll be discussing how the provenance of the source affects how useful it is for the inquiry at hand. For both of those steps, we're going to apply our contextual knowledge to develop those points. And then at the end of the paragraph, ideally we will also be including a short decision. So each source is going to have its own paragraph. We don't need to combine, we don't need to cross-reference them, we don't need to judge them against each other either. And we're going to try to write as concisely as we can, because of course in the real exam the clock is going. So let's look at our first phase of those paragraphs. Let's look firstly at content. The guidance here is that we select a useful piece of information from the source, maybe using the sentence route that you can see there. And then we're going to develop that point with our own knowledge. So the writing in blue is where I've taken a piece of content from the photograph. This is then developed with the writing in red with my own knowledge. Now when it comes to analysing provenance, there are certain features of the source that we can look at. We can look at the nature of the source, what it is. We can look at the origin, who produced the source, maybe the purpose that the source was made for, and also maybe the typicality of the source. Does it show the kind of things that we would expect to see across a long time or in many places? Now we're not going to write about all of those things, we're not going to choose all of them. What we're going to do is to choose one, maybe two, which are going to give us the best points that we can use. We don't work through these things mechanically, that's not what the examiner wants to see. So the second half of our paragraph is going to analyse provenance, maybe using the sentence route that you can see there and applying that every time, because that's going to lead us into this discussion. And then we're going to develop our points with our contextual knowledge. So again, it might look like this. The writing in black is a quite narrow analysis of provenance, and then the writing in red develops that with my own knowledge. So if we put that all together, the first half of our answer is going to look like this. First half of our paragraph here is a discussion of the content of the source, and the second part is a discussion of how the provenance of the source affects its usefulness. The key features that we're trying to include here, you can see there, is the identification of useful content, the analysis of the impacts of provenance on how useful the source is, and developing that with our own knowledge. Maybe to help us to identify these key features, here's a coloured version of that paragraph. And you can see the first half of our answer again is content from the source developed with our own knowledge. The second half of the answer is the analysis of the impacts of provenance developed with our own knowledge, and then a very short summary sentence at the end there. So we're halfway through our answer now. Our next step is to write a paragraph discussing source C and how useful it is. We're going to use the same technique here of how content affects its usefulness and also then how provenance affects its usefulness. It might be a great idea for you to try this on your own at this point. Now remember, you're not going to use all of the points that you can see in front of you. Maybe select the ones that you have the most to say about. A useful tip here, when you're discussing the provenance of the source, is to try not to be too critical and not reject sources in terms of them being biased or made too late. It's easier to pick up marks if we're positive and we look for the strength in a source rather than to reject it. It's really unlikely that our examiners are going to give us sources that are no good for the inquiry that we're looking at. It's much easier to pick up marks looking for positive aspects of the source and for things to talk about along those lines. You might want to take this even further, and if you do, here's another question that you might like to play around with using the same sources. How useful are sources B and C for an inquiry into people's attitudes towards the German government from 1920 to 1923? Try to use the same techniques if you do this. So we have a paragraph on B, then a paragraph on C, each one using content, and then own knowledge, and then provenance and own knowledge. These questions really are as simple as that. Okay, thanks for watching. There are more videos available for you to have a look at on our CHSG History channel. Do have a look at those for further guidance on all the different question types that we might face.